And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good, roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles. Controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink. We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point. Contingency procedures are in effect. We will report more as we have information available. Again, to repeat, we have a report relayed through the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. We are now looking at all the contingency operations and awaiting word from any recovery forces in the downrange field.
Pieces of debris continuing to fall from the sky.
This is Mission Control Houston. We have no additional word at this time.
The long-range NASA cameras tracking some object now in the sky, trailing a plume of black smoke behind it. Once again fixed.
Reports from the flight dynamics officer indicate that the vehicle apparently exploded and that impact in the water had a...
Good morning, everyone. There appears to have been a very serious accident involving the Space Shuttle Challenger. The launch took place just a few moments ago from Cape Canaveral. It had been delayed 4 times. It appeared to be a good launch at the point of departure from the pad at Cape Canaveral. There had been, as we said, previous delays of 4 different attempts. This was the 4th one. It had been delayed a couple of hours by ice, by a faulty gauge. Then it appeared everything was good for a launch, but shortly after the launch, there was an explosion. We have a tape now, a replay of the launch of the Shuttle Challenger this morning.
104%.
This was shortly after the launch,
We'll throttle down to 65%.
which took place shortly after 11:30 Eastern Time. It appeared that all was going well until there was a massive explosion in space. NASA has confirmed that there was an explosion with the capsule, the shuttle itself. Aboard this flight, of course, the first teacher in space, Christa McAuliffe from New Hampshire. Also aboard the flight, pilot Mike Smith, Commander Dick Scobee, Judy Resnik, and there it is. There you see that massive explosion in space, obviously a very serious accident. Let's listen to Mission Control. No communication at this precise point. They have assured us that all rescue procedures have been put into effect, but line of sight, it certainly appears to be a most serious accident, unlike anything else in the shuttle program. John Quinones at Cape Canaveral.
Here looking very carefully at the situation.
John, what do we know?
Well, Steve, no one is saying anything here other than there has been an explosion. Contingency procedures are underway. Recovery forces have been sent out into the field. Preliminary word is that the remains of the vehicle have landed somewhere in the ocean. We don't know how far, but there's been no explanation as to what happened about 90 seconds after liftoff, and it was a picture-perfect liftoff. Suddenly, as you saw it there, it exploded. There is no word on what happened. We have seen one parachute coming down. There's been no explanation as to... I think we're seeing 2 now as to what exactly those parachutes are carrying.
John, let me recap here the members of the crew. Commander Francis Scott, or I should say Dick Scobee, the pilot Mike Smith, Christa McAuliffe, the young woman, the teacher from New Hampshire, making her first voyage into space. There you see now one of the parachutes coming down. That is the first hopeful sign of any kind that we have seen since the explosion that took place after the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning. Recapping the crew members: Commander Dick Scobee, pilot Mike Smith, Judith Resnik, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, and Christa McAuliffe, the teacher from New Hampshire. That could be the escape capsule. That is certainly what one would hope, that there has been a successful escape of the crew. But you saw the magnitude of the explosion that did take place shortly after the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger. The Challenger finally lifting off this morning after 3 previous postponements. More delays today. The weather has been cold. There were icicles on the pad. There was a faulty gauge that had to be repaired. Once again, we're going to show you a tape of the
Engines at
launch.
65%, 3 engines
There you
running
see
normally,
the Challenger,
3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs.
minutes after takeoff.
Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
Paramedics are being sent to the area where that chute is coming down,
Engines
hopefully
throttling
a
up, 3
chute
engines now to 104%.
containing the escape
Challenger,
capsule
go
for
at
the
throttle
crew.
up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
It appeared to be a good launch, and then you saw it.
1 minute 15
That
seconds.
massive
Velocity
explosion
2,900 feet per second.
over
Altitude
the
9
Atlantic.
nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
This, the 25th shuttle mission, the first attempted from a second pad at Cape Canaveral, but obviously this one unlike any other. It had been planned for a 6-day mission, among other things to release and retrieve a satellite that would study Halley's Comet. But of course, the most attention going to the presence among the 6-member crew of Christine McAuliffe of New Hampshire, a school teacher who was to teach 2 lessons by satellite to school children all around the country from the space capsule. But now this massive explosion and accident, officials at the Cape simply do not know yet what the outcome is for the 7-member crew. John Quinones, can you give us your perspective of the launch and of the explosion?
Steve, we were watching it as it lifted off. It was, again, a picture-perfect liftoff. About 90 seconds after liftoff, we saw this spectacular explosion. It just fell apart in the air, and we saw pieces fall and pluming smoke. We, at that time, did not realize what had happened. Part of the spaceship appeared to have continued shooting skyward. We did not learn that there had actually been an explosion until about a minute later.
What we're seeing now, of course, is a picture from Mission Control.
A parachute that is now floated to the ground. Again, recovery teams and paramedics are on their way over there to see, in hopes that, of course, that it is the escape capsule, one would hope, and that the shuttle crew, the 7 members of that crew, including school teacher Christa McAuliffe, are on board and would be safe. We have no definitive word, though, on survivors.
John, the latest word we're getting is that the chute does appear to have been large enough to have been the chute for the escape capsule, and that certainly will remain the hope of everyone here as we await the report from NASA officials and from the medical team that is on the way to the location of that chute. Here you see an earlier tape recording of the chute coming down from the massive explosion, and that is where the story and all our hopes lie at this moment. The hope that there can be survivors. A crew of 7, the first such accident in the shuttle program on the 25th shuttle mission. Once again, let's repeat the members, the 7 members of the crew aboard the shuttle Challenger today. The commander, Dick Scobee, pilot Mike Smith, of course, the person that everyone's been watching, Christa McAuliffe, a school teacher from New Hampshire, other crew members, Judith Resnik, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, and Gregory Jarvis. The 7 crew members having to wait days through 3 previous postponements for weather and other technical problems. Today, their launch delayed at least 2 hours from the initial point of departure. Today, by faulty gauge and icicles on the pad. Now you're seeing the actual launch itself, and you can hear the cheers and the whoops in the background from Mission Control as it appeared to be a good, safe, and successful launch.
Challenger now heading downrange.
You can hear the voice of Mission Control, calm, calling off what appeared to be normal procedures.
Engines beginning
the role
throttling
that's
down
built
now
into
at 94%.
the
Normal
launch
throttles,
trajectory.
most of the flight, 104%.
This the recording at
We'll throttle down
11:39
to,
this morning,
65% shortly.
nearly 15 minutes ago now.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs.
Well, we are
Velocity 2,257 feet per second.
We are
Altitude,
now
4.3
told that
nautical miles, downrange
the
distance,
chute we
3
saw
nautical
was not the escape capsule. And that is
Engines
bad
throttling
news.
up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per
There
second.
was the
Altitude,
explosion.
9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
At that point, this 25th mission became something far different from any other for the Space Shuttle program. Plagued by so many delays in the last few weeks, so many questions about its economic viability. At this point, we're going to show you tape of the 7 crew members as they
Here looking very carefully at the situation.
boarded the shuttle Challenger for the launch this morning.
We have no doubt.
There you see the crew members. Commander Dick Scobee, pilot Mike Smith, Christa McAuliffe, Judy Resnik, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis. This had been planned as a 6-day mission. And you see how the crew went through this procedure. This the 4th morning because of the problems encountered, both technical and with the weather. This morning, more problems. A faulty gauge, icicles on the pad. This a live shot now at the Cape where you can only see the traces of smoke left in the air from the explosion that took place less than 2 minutes after the launch of the Challenger this morning. John Quinones, the latest word you're getting from the Cape.
NASA Select now, Steve, is not broadcasting anything on the rescue operations or on the cause of the explosion. There is silence here. Many of the telephones are out at the Kennedy Space Center. So there has been no explanation to hundreds of reporters that are here watching. Of course, the focus of this mission had been the flight of the first private citizen on a shuttle, Christa McAuliffe. We have information on the crew, of course. The commander was indeed Francis Scobee, born in Washington, in the state of Washington. He is married to June Kent of San Antonio, Texas. Commander Scobee enlisted in the U.S. Air Force. Pilot Michael Smith, he's from Beaufort, North Carolina, and his NASA experience is being one of the astronauts selected, a candidate by NASA in 1980, and has been in the program for 6 years now. One of the other astronauts, Lieutenant Colonel Ellison Onizuka from Hawaii. 4th astronaut Ronald McNair from Lake City, South Carolina. There were 2 women on board, Judy Resnik from Akron, Ohio, and of course Christa McAuliffe, born in Boston, Massachusetts. The payload specialist, Gregory Jarvis, and he is born in Detroit, Michigan. We have no word on what indeed has happened to the crew, although quite frankly there is not much hope now that we've been told that the escape capsule, or what we saw come down by parachute anyway, is not the capsule containing the astronauts.
John, we've been told now that President Reagan
the
at
magnitude of that explosion was, as you saw, very severe. It appeared that the shuttle was just blown apart by whatever triggered that explosion.
Thank you, John. We have been told now by Sam Donaldson at the White House that President Reagan has been alerted and has been watching tape replays of the shuttle accident. For those of you who may have just tuned in, there has been a serious accident involving the Space Shuttle Challenger on this 25th Space Shuttle mission. Less than 2 minutes after launch, a massive explosion off the coast of Florida, and it appears that there are no survivors. There is no final confirmation from NASA. In fact, we're getting no information now from NASA. There has been a complete blackout of information and communications. There was one parachute that came down. It was not an escape capsule for the 7-member crew. And this was a mission that had been postponed 3 previous times. Finally, after further delays this morning, what appeared to be a picture-perfect launch, and yet some 90 seconds later, that massive explosion in the sky. NASA control had been calmly clicking off the various elements of the launch that now here we're going to Larry Speaks at the White House, who apparently has an announcement coming up.
What he has just seen replayed on television concerning the shuttle launch. We do not have any more information than is being provided to the public at this time. The way the President found out about it is he was in the Oval Office with a group of senior staff preparing for some questions with a group of network correspondents and anchors that were having lunch in the White House today regarding the budget and the State of the Union. The Vice President and the Foreign Policy Advisor, John Poindexter, came in with others and informed the President that the news had just broken. We immediately adjourned our Oval Office meeting and went into an adjoining room, the President's study, where there's a television, and the President then began to review television reports of the explosion there shortly after the launch. So once again, the President is concerned, he is saddened, he is very anxious to have more information on it. At the moment, as I say, we're learning most of our information from what the public is getting.
What is your best information as to the condition of the crew, Larry, at this point?
We don't have any more information than what is being provided to the public on television. Hopefully later we will be able to get some, and that's the President's first priority, is to find out what information that is available. We just don't have any more. No, we have not from the Oval Office.
Will this affect in any way the plans for the State of the Union tonight?
I don't believe so. I'm certain that the President will feel compelled to mention this, depending on the outcome of what we learn here in a few minutes.
Will it affect the shuttle program, Larry?
Well, that's hard to say, you know, here in 15 or 20 minutes after an incident of this type is concerned. I'm sure it will not affect the United States' determination to consider to continue the exploration of space and all the benefits we've received from it. While this is indeed tragic, it certainly will not deter the United States in its interest in space exploration.
Well, with all the problems that the shuttle has had, will any substantial reevaluation be done of the program itself?
Well, once again, you're very premature in asking a question concerning the future of the space program. The United States has met adversity many times before in the space program. It is one of the most effective and successful programs of that type that any country has ever undertaken.
Larry, can you tell us anything specifically that the President said, any quotations, and did he make any mention of the fact that the teacher that he suggested, that the program of a teacher in space, that teacher was on board this flight?
Well, I know that was on his mind. Quite frankly, the President stood there in almost stunned silence as he watched the television. You could certainly read the concern, the sorrow, the anxiety on his face as he watched, and the group watched around him. As I say, he was virtually watched in silence.
Might anyone from the White House be leading some sort of investigating team, or will it just be up to NASA to investigate this?
All this is very, very early, and there's just nothing we can say. Our immediate concern is the crew, and all of these other questions will just have to be deferred until much later.
Was anything said about the fact that the teacher was on board this plane?
Well, it was something that was on all of our minds, that we did have the first teacher in space, really the first civilian, so to speak, other than our members of Congress who have flown in space, and certainly that's on our mind.
Are there any scientific aides who have been able to say that they could survive such an explosion?
Just don't have that kind of information yet.
You said that the Vice President, after Poindexter, informed the President. How did the White House learn about it?
I'm certain that we probably learned it from the news media, as we do many times when incidents like this occur unexpectedly.
Might this influence the decision about whether other civilians will be allowed on the shuttle from now on, Larry?
Once again, all of these questions, our immediate concern is for the fate of the crew, to find out exactly what has happened to those 7 people aboard. All of these other questions we'll just have to wait till later. Dale?
Tell us anything about what the President's schedule, how the President's schedule is changing now?
The President's schedule has not changed. He will keep on with what he had planned today and the State of the Union tonight. And once again, I think the only change in his schedule would be to simply be updated and try to seek the facts in this.
Will the President be making any phone calls to the family, Larry?
I just don't know. It customarily does, but we're going to wait till we find out what the facts are.
Larry, he watched in silence, but were there no quotes that you could give us?
Nothing. It was virtually in silence.
Are you going to know what's being done now, Larry, in terms of searching for?
No. All of that information we just do not have yet. Dale, you had one question and you want to go? Okay.
What are your plans? What are your plans about briefing the rest of the afternoon on that?
Well, I think once we find out what the facts are and particularly what the fate of the crew is, then we'll be prepared to say something.
Larry, did you detect any sign of emotion as the President watched? Was he shaking his head? Was his eyes moist?
Concern, anxiety, silence.
You've been listening to a briefing by White House spokesman Larry Speaks. The President expressing his obvious concern. He's been watching the tapes, but he does not know any more than we do about the fate of the 7-member crew of the Challenger after that tremendous explosion less than 2 minutes after launch from Cape Canaveral this morning. With me now, Peter Jennings, who has been at the White House this morning and is here in Washington with me. Peter, you've been following this shuttle program like the rest of us. Just a tremendous shock so shortly after liftoff.
In fact, Steve, I must tell you, you heard Larry speak, so I was actually sitting in the White House with a group of other correspondents waiting for the President to come in and talk to us about the State of the Union message, and Don Regan, the Chief of Staff, was handed a note and said to us simply, the space shuttle has exploded, details to follow, at which point I fled the room, and I sympathize with Mr. Speaks at this point because he indeed is getting virtually all of his information at this point from us. That critical moment for people who've just joined us occurred, as you've been telling us, thank you, with 90 seconds roughly after liftoff. And very interesting, as I rushed from the White House, almost the very first explanation, or perhaps explanation, was that it occurred as they went from power up. And here we see it again. You can see on the outside there, of course, those are the solid rocket boosters. And listening to John Lyons, ABC's longtime space observer, coming back on the radio in the taxi, John was saying, of course, if it is those solid rocket boosters which go, they would drive the Challenger itself totally out of control.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
There it is. There's the phrase, throttle up, which means they're going to increase from about 65.
There was the explosion.
There it is.
The interesting thing is, we're being told by NASA control that it was a completely normal liftoff from their perspective, and prior to the explosion, there was no indication of any trouble, as you could detect from the voice of Mission Control.
That's right. In fact, it must have been extraordinarily stunning in Mission Control for the Mission Control communicator to catch up mentally with what he was seeing on his screen, very much as we are seeing. The first air disaster, or the first in-air disaster, in the 56 U.S. man-in-space missions. You'll recall, Steve, there was a disaster on the ground back in 1967 during the Apollo program, but this is the first in all of the manned space program.
Peter, we have tape now of NASA's first explanation of exactly what happened. NASA has been quite silent, but here is their information.
Repeating the information that we have at this time. We had an apparently nominal liftoff this morning at 11:38. Eastern Time. The ascent phase appeared normal through approximately the completion of the roll program and throttle down and engine throttle back to 104%. At that point, we had an apparent explosion. Subsequent to that, the tracking crews reported to the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle appeared to have exploded and that we had an impact in the water downrange at a location approximately 28.64 degrees north, 80.28 degrees west. At the time the data was lost with the vehicle, according to a poll by the flight director Jay Green of the positions here in Mission Control, there were no anomalous indications, no indications of problems with the engines or with the SRBs or with any of the other systems at that moment through the point at which we lost data. Again, this is preliminary information. It's all that we have at the moment, and we will keep you advised as other information becomes available. We had, there are recovery forces in the general area, others being deployed, including aircraft and ships. We saw what we believe to be paramedics parachuting into the impact area, and we have no additional word at this point. We will keep you advised as details become available to us. This is Mission Control, Houston.
There you have it, Peter.
I was just going to say, Steve, one of the very first things we would like to have people behind the scenes check is whether or not Challenger had an escape mechanism. Columbia did have one, but I'm under the impression that Challenger does not have the same configuration.
The parachute that we originally saw and reported as possibly an escape capsule is probably not a part of this new one. Yeah. And as NASA Mission Control just advised us, the parachutes could have been paramedics dropping into the area of the impact of apparent wreckage in the Atlantic. What we have here is a situation where NASA nor anyone else is going to say what the final resolution is for the 7 crew members, but there is absolutely no hopeful sign from anything we've seen so far, that massive explosion. We have tape now of the 7...
Steve, just before you go, hey, let me just interrupt, because somebody did say to me, that in fact, Challenger does not have the escape capsule. Columbia did in one of its early stages. We've had 24 of these missions. Columbia had it, Challenger did not. So what we were not seeing an escape capsule falling some 20, 30 miles out into the Atlantic.
Which, of course, does nothing to increase any signs of hopefulness. We were saying we have tape of the members of the crew early this morning as they had breakfast together before the mission. This 7-member crew, of course, the most prominent member, Christa McAuliffe, the school teacher from New Hampshire, the first private citizen astronaut from among 11,000 teacher applicants. As she is on your right this morning, her husband and 2 children were watching the liftoff on television. Other members of the crew, Commander Francis Dick Scobee, co-pilot Michael Smith, crewmates Judith Resnik, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, along with Christa McAuliffe.
Dick Scobee, of course, the spacecraft commander who has been an NASA astronaut since back in 1978, an experienced commander, and a tremendous setback this morning as you see the crew in a much happier circumstance, not long before they went off on what is surely, without question, the most ill-fated mission of the 24 space shuttle missions that have been flown in the last 5 years. Christa McAuliffe, as Steve has said, was clearly the most visible person on the flight, the first teacher in space, the first civilian other than a congressman. And ABC's Lynn Scher has been with her through much of the training program and now has a report on it.
That was a thrill.
When she left her classroom behind for a semester of space training, 37-year-old Christa McAuliffe temporarily traded 12 years of teaching for a new kind of learning. Listen to her description of the airplane ride that simulates zero gravity.
As you peak that parabola at the top, you have about 20 or 30 seconds of weightlessness, and all of a sudden, just like Peter Pan, you start flying up, and it was just unbelievable.
That's the enthusiasm that's made her a favorite of students at Concord High School in New Hampshire. This is where the Boston-born social studies teacher lives with her husband and 2 children, and where she put together her winning lesson plan. It's clear from her NASA application that Christa McAuliffe took special care to relate her classes here at Concord High School to what she calls the real world. Her philosophy of teaching, she wrote, stresses community activities. The economics class finds out how local construction projects impact the city. Law classes visit the local courts.
She can take very complex concepts and simplify them, but not water them down, and she makes all her students understand things, but in an interesting manner.
She was explaining like the assembly line process, and she went into this story about when she used to package Twinkies on an assembly line. And I mean, I just laughed so hard, but I'm not gonna forget it.
That's also what helped her application stand out among the 11,000 NASA received, and what changed her life.
The teacher who will be going into space, Christa McAuliffe.
Suddenly, she was a celebrity. McAuliffe and her family were paraded along Main Street and featured on the front page. When she reported to NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, she was poked and prodded and outfitted and observed.
She's a sort of a risk taker. She does the unusual, the way she runs a class, and she's not afraid of things. She lives life. She's not afraid of it.
Teachers are always prepared.
And while she taught history and economics, her students figured out there was something else on her mind, too.
Even on the quizzes, she'd throw in an extra credit quiz about what are the 5 names of the space shuttle. So we always knew her interest in space was high.
McAuliffe's crewmates have graded her well, acknowledging theirs will always be known as the teacher mission. And she hopes the lesson about space travel on the shuttle will not just be for youngsters.
People actually, adults have asked me, how many stops is that shuttle going to make? Bring me back a moon rock.
It's the kind of misinformation Christa McAuliffe wants to correct. And it's why the high school teacher from New England won't be watching the next space shuttle launch. She'll be on it. Lynn Scher, ABC News, Concord, New Hampshire.
37-year-old Christa McAuliffe from New Hampshire, something of a risk taker, as someone described her, and among the millions and millions of people today who will be excruciatingly saddened by this tragedy are a number of her own school children who went down to the Cape yesterday, Stephen, were expressing, I remember on World News last night, how disappointed they were that the mission had not got off last night.
And of course there were also the many students from her high school in New Hampshire who were all in an assembly room watching the launch on television and were quickly returned to their own rooms by the teachers and the staff at the school after the apparent tragedy took place.
Just to remind you of exactly when it did take place, and also to admit to you that we're very much, as much in the dark as you are. We haven't heard much more from Mission Control than the bare basics. And it is, I think, probably, Steve, to some extent, a reflection of how successful the space program has been, and the shuttle program particularly, that those of us, like you and me, who followed the space programs with absolute passion 10 and 15 years ago, have begun to take it rather like the country did, rather casually, not knowing all of the details of every mission as intimately as we would have 10 or 15 years ago.
And we should recap for those of us, for those of you who may have just have joined us, that on this 25th launch of the Space Shuttle program, there has been a tremendous explosion, what appears to be a major tragedy and setback for the space program. Some 90 seconds after launch, when all appeared to be going well, as you will see in just a few moments, suddenly this massive explosion and almost complete silence from Cape Canaveral.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
You can tell there so instantly that the Mission Control communicator, the rest of us, was hardly even looking at his screen or couldn't believe what's happened. And there you see flying out of control what we don't know, perhaps the solid rocket boosters, which are on the outside of the shuttle, or whether the external tank itself, which is attached to the shuttle, actually blew up. But at that point, they were going just under 2,000 miles an hour, 3 times the speed of sound. And if it whatever it was, the solid rocket boosters or the external tank, it would have clearly driven the shuttle itself out of control. Let's listen to mission control.
Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
At this point, Challenger was 10.5 miles up and 8 miles out over the ocean. Debris has been scattered over a fairly wide area, some of it within 8 or 10 miles of Cape Canaveral itself. We cannot tell you, much to our regret, we cannot tell you what that is plunging towards the Atlantic Ocean. 7 crew members on board. Christa McAuliffe, the high school teacher. That parachute, by the way, perhaps a misleading picture for you. We've said a few while ago that Challenger did not have an escape capsule on board. There is some belief seeping up from Houston and from the Cape that that may be someone of a rescue function parachuting into the Atlantic. But again, we cannot tell you with any certainty anything more than we have.
Peter, this was the 4th attempt for the launch of this particular shuttle flight. 3 previous ones had been forced to postpone because of either weather problems or technical problems. And even today, there had been a delay. One because of a faulty fuel gauge, and another because of icicles on the launch pad. A temperature of 24 degrees this morning at Cape Canaveral.
John Quinones, who has been covering space for us down at Cape Canaveral, is now standing by at the Cape. And John, you clearly saw this with your own eye and not on a television monitor, am I correct?
That's right, Peter. I was outside with hundreds of spectators about 10 minutes before the scheduled liftoff. The launching had been delayed 3 days due to bad weather. As we reported last night, it was rescheduled to finally leave at 9:38 this morning. But we had a hard freeze here in Cape Canaveral overnight, and when we arrived at the launch pad, we saw a launch pad deck covered with ice. Overnight, water and fuel systems had been kept draining, bleeding over that area so that the fluids on the spaceship or launch pad would not freeze. At about 8 this morning, NASA told us that there was another problem with a fire detector, this time on board the Challenger. Some electronic components of that fire detector were replaced, and then we were told that at that time, all systems were go. The liftoff delayed by just 1 hour this morning and then rescheduled till 9:38. Finally, there were more delays. Apparently, the weather was a concern. Delayed till 11:38. Just minutes before the scheduled liftoff, I was out there in the spectator stands with hundreds of people, among them 18 school children from Christa McAuliffe's hometown, third-grade students who attended school with Christa's son, Scott Corrigan. Those children watched, gasping at the liftoff, very impressed, obviously. It appeared that very few of the spectators knew what had happened until about a minute into the liftoff when NASA control announced that something had gone wrong. The shuttle Challenger simply blew apart as we saw it from the ground. I am told with a force of 2.5 million pounds of thrust. Awesome power that even NASA admits may leave very little to recover.
Let me ask you this. There must be turmoil there, John, at the Cape, as I'm sure there is in Houston as well. Do you have any indication from anyone there of an official or expert nature what may have happened?
No idea.
Well, that's simple, and that is clear, John.
We understand, Peter, that the recovery crews, we saw 2 parachutes that NASA cameras picked up and showed us floating to the ground.
David, who?
We are being told that it is believed that those are paramedics headed into the recovery area to see what they can find.
Okay, John, thank you very much. John Quinones at the Cape. Of course, once the Challenger was taken off mission control, that is to say the control of the mission shifts to Houston in Texas. And so at Cape Canaveral, why, as we suggest, there may be turmoil this morning, there is not an absolute amount they're going to be able, I think, Steve, to provide us in terms of information.
We've been told, Peter, that President Reagan was watching in stunned silence the replay after he was informed of what had happened. And one of the first recognitions of this morning's apparent tragedy came from the House of Representatives, which declared a moment of silence. The Reverend James David Ford, the chaplain, leading the House in the silence. Let's listen.
And at this special moment, let us remember in silent prayer those who were involved in the spacecraft shuttle accident just a few minutes ago off Florida. Let us pray.
Reverend James David Ford leading the House of Representatives in a moment of silence.
May your spirit, O Lord, be with them, and may your love follow them and their families this day and every day, we pray. Amen.
This recognition for the 7 crew members of the Shuttle Challenger. The Challenger exploding less than 2 minutes off the launch pad this morning. No official word yet on the fate of the 7 crew members, but there is very little to hope for at this point.
I've just been thinking, Steve, as to why people at Mission Control, or even people watching this on television, might not have been alarmed in the first instance, because about 2.5 minutes into flight, normally, when those big external tanks break off, we are accustomed now to seeing this great ball of fire as those 2 tanks drop off and fall into the Atlantic.
Sitting here watching protectively, because we take these for granted now, that was the first thought of all of us. Hopefully, this is just an aberration on the normal separation that takes place. Obviously, it was much more than that. Let's look now at tape of the crew members as they arrived at Cape Canaveral last week.
Thank you very much.
Scobee,
thanks a lot, y'all.
Astronauts Judy Resnik, Ellison Onizuka, Ron McNair, Greg Jarvis, and of course, Christa McAuliffe,
and
teacher from New Hampshire.
They represent a great deal of the country, too, as you look at their names and see them before the mission. Dick Scobee is from Washington State. Mike Smith was born in Beaufort, North Carolina. Judy Resnik was born in Akron, Ohio. Ronald McNair from Lake City, South Carolina. Ellison Onizuka was born on the island of Kona in Hawaii, and Greg Jarvis, who is the payload specialist on board the mission, was born, if I'm not mistaken, in Boston, but I'm not absolutely sure about that one either. The same thing, by the way, Steve, has happened in the House of Representatives, happened in the Senate. Senator Jake Garn from Utah, of course, had been the first politician who had flown in space, rushed over to the Senate floor where he wanted to make a statement. There's no question. I mean, again, I have to come back to this business at the White House. We were all sitting around waiting for the president, as is often traditional on the day of the president's going to make a State of the Union message. And his chief of staff is there, and his aides, and the president is in the next room preparing to come in. And there is this stunned silence where the safety of individual Americans on something which, A, we've become so accustomed to, but B, has just become so symbolic of America, this search into space, when it all happened. I don't doubt this is happening all over the country.
And it is just a simple fact that we identify with these people as special people, even though we had come to take for granted the remarkable feats that they accomplish on a regular basis. This, the 25th launch of a space shuttle, and the first one to have anything like this happen to it. An obvious, terrible accident in air, an explosion less than 2 minutes after liftoff, after NASA officials had said the liftoff appeared to be completely normal, no indication of any trouble of any kind.
While we go on, by the way, we hope that someone behind the scenes is listening very hard to Mission Control in Houston and can we haven't heard anything from them in the last few minutes. They are very quiet, I am told, at the moment, but it behooves us, I think, not to write off these 7 people until we're told so by Mission Control. I was thinking of the president because it was he who made this determination that we'd have a teacher in space because the teacher was so symbolic of the aspirations of Americans in general. I think the president must have taken this very hard today.
11,000 applicants after the president made that announcement that the teacher would be the first private citizen in space, and Christa McAuliffe, the very dynamic and vivacious teacher from New Hampshire, the one who made the final selection. And as many of you saw just a few moments ago, Lynn Scher's report showing how much she obviously was enjoying her training as an astronaut. One of her colleagues at her school in New Hampshire describing her as something of a risk taker. Christa McAuliffe, among the 7 crew members aboard the Challenger when it exploded this morning.
The element of risk clearly is felt most poignantly by the families. Last week, for example, Kathy Lee Crosby on ABC was interviewing Christa McAuliffe's husband, Steve, and you get some sense there of enormous pride but also anxiety. Let's look at that for a second.
What about Christa's special qualities? What do you think it is about her that's so special that she's bringing to this mission?
Oh, I think obviously she's very bright. She's a super teacher, and she's genuinely a nice person, and I think she has that ability to just excite people. Certainly, she's excited me over the years.
Oh, that's nice to hear. Has she been disappointed at all by the disappointments of the Space Shuttle Challenger or Columbia? That there was the frequent delays in taking off, and then there was a difficulty in landing. Is she concerned about that?
Oh, I don't think so at all. I think we've always looked at that as proof positive that they don't launch them unless it's absolutely perfect, and if there's anything the slightest bit out of order, they wait and correct it, and I certainly take comfort in that, and I wouldn't mind at all that it be postponed if there's something wrong.
You bet. We wish you all the best, Stephen. God bless. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
We'll be right.
Interview not with Kathy Lee Crosby, Kathy Lee Johnson on Good Morning America last week with Christa McAuliffe's husband, who says there's this tremendous confidence in NASA and the space program. And while we sometimes got very frustrated, and I must say took a few shots at NASA when Columbia was delayed 6 times, as I recall. There it goes again, something's gone wrong. It is that determination that's always existed in the space program to make sure that nothing goes wrong, which leads to these delays. And the search for what went wrong today, which, as you said earlier, is an incredible setback to the shuttle program, at least, is just going to make, I think, people that much more conscious of safety as they were after the Apollo blow-up in '67.
When you look at husband Steve there in that tape recording, then you stop to realize that he and the 2 children, McAuliffe children, were watching live the launch this morning. And of course, less than 2 minutes after the launch, the massive explosion in space.
It is now just a little after 12:30 in the eastern United States, and not by any means to repeat it for the sake of repeating it, but because that's a program change in many of the places around the country. We're going to run again the liftoff of the Challenger as it took off from Cape Canaveral this morning. John Quinones described it to us from the Cape just a few moments ago as perfectly normal in every respect. You'll recall it had been delayed yesterday because of high weather, and had been delayed the day before because they couldn't get a screw fully tightened down on one of the hatches. But for those of you around the country who may just be joining us now for the first time and may not have heard the news or perhaps not have seen it, here again is the liftoff of the shuttle from the Cape this morning.